All right, well, my clock is showing that it is high noon here in Colorado on a gorgeous spring day. So welcome to CSL in session. If you haven't had a chance, feel free to take just a moment to fill out the poll before we move into the meat of today's presentation. Basically, we're trying to get a little bit of information about why you decided to attend this session. And it looks like we're kind of tied between library has conducted user research and wanting to learn more, or that your library has plans, but also a good majority of you are just personally interested in user research, which I think is fabulous. So I'll give you just another couple minutes here to fill out the poll if you haven't had a chance.
This is Bobby Hammond, the presenter. Please let me know in the chat if you can't hear me or if I'm talking too loud.
I think it sounds good, but people can let us know. All right, so we still have a couple people trickling in here. But it does look like that a good majority are just personally interested in user research in general, and a couple of you that your library has either done it and you want to learn more, or your library maybe has plans to do it. So Bobby, would you like me to go ahead and launch the introduction?
Yeah, sure. I'm ready.
All right. Well, as I said earlier, welcome to CSL in session. Today's session is Learning from Your Patrons and Introduction to User Research. My name is Christine Krieger, and I'm the Professional Development Consultant for the Colorado State Library. So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce you to CSL in session in case you haven't attended before. Many of you may be familiar with sort of one-way webinars where you sort of get to zone out, maybe check Facebook, eat your lunch, those kinds of things. But today we're going to shake things up a little bit, and we're hoping to have some discussion about user research with your patrons. Sorry, I haven't had my lunch yet either. So we're going to have opportunities for you guys to share. The majority of the way you're going to share today is via the chat, and several of you have used the chat to introduce yourself, and if you haven't, feel free to go ahead and continue that. So as we go through today's session, we may be asking you some specific questions. We have, I think, one more poll that we're going to use today, but we want to kind of find out what questions and concerns you guys have, things that you've tried, etc. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Bobby Hammond, who is the Colorado State Library's Digital Experience.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Christine. Yes, I'm the Digital Experience Consultant, which means mostly that I build and administer websites for the State Library and other library-related organizations. But I also have some training in user research, and that's what I'm going to talk about here today. But to start out, I'd like to hear more from you guys about what kinds of user research you have done already or are doing, or even just the type of research you're interested in doing if you've heard about any.
And you guys can type in the chat area if you guys, basically if you've tried user research or your organization has, feel free to let.
User testing for the website, okay. Great. So user testing on websites and ILSs. Suggestion box, good. Okay. So looks like many different people have experience, especially with user testing and some other types of survey research, database trials, that sort of thing. Let's see. Oh,
It's just
I have to figure out how to advance my slides here. There we go. So there are many different kinds of user research. These are a short list that occurred to me just sort of off the top of my head. So there's surveys, suggestion boxes, very informal types of data gathering. Even web analytics is a type of user research, I think. You're sort of observing them secondhand, perhaps. You could do focus groups to look at particular issues in your library or with your users. You could do card sorting to see if there are different ways of organizing information that would be more useful to your patrons. Interviews, personas, usability testing, and heuristic evaluations, that sort of thing. We can't talk about all of those things today. Instead, I want to just focus on one particular method, which some of you have some experience with before, which is usability testing. This is one of the most common and probably one of the most useful research methods. I've done it many times before with websites, which are the main focus of my work, but there's no reason that you can't also apply it to other things as well with a little imagination, although there might be some technical hurdles as well, but we can talk about that later. So in a nutshell, this is the process of what you do. You get someone who represents a typical patron of your library to do a few tasks with your website or whatever system you're testing, and you observe them while they work on the tasks, and you ask them to think out loud to tell you what they are seeing, thinking, and feeling while they work. And by listening and observing to the participants and noticing where they succeed or fail at the tasks, you can identify ways you can make your library easier for your patrons to use. And that's basically the whole process. So, as Brad Goodman might say, there's no trick to it, it's just a simple trick. Does anybody know who, just the Brad Goodman reference may be a little dated there, but anyway. So you don't have to do this with very many people to identify most of the significant problems with the usability of the system that you're testing. So we have another poll here too. Is that right, Christine? So how many times do you have to repeat a usability test in order to identify most of the significant usability problems? Oh, one person chose 5,000. Wow. That's an ambitious researcher. So yeah, some of you have done some usability testing before, and you can see that most of the answers are sort of clustered there at the bottom among 5 and 10, and that's basically your goal for most usability testing. It depends a little bit about what specifically you're testing and what kind of outcome measures you have, but mostly it's a qualitative method. You're not trying to gather a lot of statistically reliable quantitative information, and you really just have to do 5 to 10 usability sessions to identify most of the significant problems. So most of the libraries I've worked in have been pretty small libraries, and I was basically a one-person user experience web systems librarian. But even just being a one-person shop, I could still usually do some sort of simple research project at least every 6 months, maybe even one a month, depending on what you were looking at. So it's not a really elaborate research protocol. At least it doesn't have to be. So you can do this quickly, and you can try to identify some problems, fix your problems, and then do another round of testing again to see if you've actually fixed what you hoped you would fix. So let's look at the research process in a bit more detail, and I'll give you some tips and tricks to make it as productive as possible for you. And at the end, I'll recommend some other resources that you should look at to learn more about usability testing. But first, I thought it would make more sense to you if we did a little demonstration of a usability test. So Christine has volunteered to be a participant for this evaluation, and she'll share her screen so you can all see what she's doing. And then she should share her audio as well so we can hear what she says. So I'm going to give her a task to complete with a website. And while she's working on the task, the rest of you should observe what she is doing and try to identify to yourself any usability problems that you notice with the site. All right?
And you can feel free.
Are you ready?
You can feel free to mock me mercilessly in the chat because I can't see it right now. So you can make fun of my searching skills.
No mocking, please. Okay. So first, I'm just going to thank you, Christine, for volunteering to be a participant. I'm going to describe to you a short scenario with a task that I'd like you to complete with the website that we're evaluating. And as you work on the task, I'd like you to think out loud and tell me what you're seeing and thinking. And please remember that we're testing the website and not you, so there are no right or wrong answers. Okay. You are a participant in the evaluation, and the website is the subject.
All right.
So does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So the site that we are going to look at today is the Denver Public Library. So could you please go to their homepage?
All right. I think I am there. Denver Public Library.
Okay. So don't click on anything right now, but feel free to scroll around on this page and just give me your general impressions.
It's got a pretty clean interface. Things are kind of in boxes, sort of blog-like, but
okay.
It's not overly cluttered.
Okay. Now here's the task that I'd like you to work on. Let's say that you recently moved to Denver and you would like to visit the library nearest you. So find a map that shows all the library branches and find out what time the library branch nearest to your house closes today. Does that make sense?
It does. So right now
okay,
I'm looking
so just
at the top across kind of the main menu. And I'm not necessarily seeing locations there. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. On the left side, kind of underneath the Central Library's hours, I do see an all locations. So I'm going to try that.
Okay.
So I do see a list of library locations, and I have since forgotten the second part of what you asked me to do.
I'd like you to find a map of all the library locations and then find out what time the library nearest your house closes.
The library nearest my house is in Brighton, so but I need to find the map to see. So now I'm scrolling because they have a lot of branches.
Okay.
Addresses and phone numbers. Maybe if I just click on a branch, maybe a map will pop up. It does, but it doesn't list all of their libraries. So I'm going back to if I click on location and hours, which I kind of just did thinking I'd go back to the previous page, I now see a map of locations.
Okay.
So I can enter my zip code. And I'm going to have to put it's probably not going to give me anything. I'll put the zip code of where I work.
You could pretend that you live somewhere else. Yeah, that's fine.
So I put in my work zip code. And it's still bringing up quite a few. I'm sort of scrolling. I'm going to go back to, let's narrow it down to 2 miles. We're all within 2 miles. All right.
Diane is complimenting your serendipitous discovery of the locations now.
So I do happen to know the Central Branch is close to where I work, but it is sort of interesting that when I type in my zip code, and maybe the zip code is just too big.
Yeah.
But I'm still pulling up multiple branches.
So can you find the hours of any of those library locations?
All locations. Yes. So the Central Library, when I go back to the location and hours page, it does list all of their branches with their address and phone number, as well as what days what hours they are open each day, because it can vary by location.
Okay, great. So do you feel that you succeeded at that task?
I do feel like I succeeded. That might be the only thing I succeed at today.
Okay. Okay, great.
Now I have to see if
Um,
I can succeed at getting back.
all right.
Do you want me to
So
go back?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's the whole task that we're going to do for the moment. So what sort of usability problems did you guys see in that short demonstration? Yeah. Yeah, it was difficult for her to find the map, and she actually only happened upon it by accident. The link to the locations was below the fold, as we say. She had to scroll down to find it. Yeah, and there may have been some functionality problems with the map. I mean, when she did a search on her zip code, she seemed to not eliminate any of the branches that were displayed. So let me just note a couple of things that were part of this demonstration. First of all, it was a pretty simple task, and it was pretty straightforward. Um, you might, if depending on what you were testing, add some restrictions to the task. So, for instance, if you're interested in how your navigation menus work, you might ask the participants to use the navigation menus and ask them not to use search. Or if you're interested in search, you might specifically direct them to search instead of using the navigation menus, or you could do both. Um, I didn't, in this demonstration, ask any preliminary questions, but sometimes you'd want to do that as well, just to get a sense of how skilled a computer user the participant is, just to have some sort of quick gauge on the prior knowledge that they bring to the task. In a normal session, obviously, you probably would have more than one task. Usually the sessions last about 30 to 50 minutes, and you work on maybe 6 to 10 tasks, but the process for each task is basically the same. And it's, like I said, it's not a very elaborate protocol. If you're interested, this is another demonstration that's available on YouTube, and I'm sure there are lots of others as well. But this one is done by Steve Krug, who's a usability expert whose books I will plug later on in the webinar. So you could save this link and look at this later, because it's if you would like to see another example, someone who's really skilled at this, Steve Krug is a good one to look at. So now let's look in more detail at how you can plan, run, and evaluate the user tests like this for your library. These are the 4 phases of the process. You plan the evaluation, you recruit the participants, you actually run the evaluation, and then you evaluate your results. And we'll look at each of these in turn and hopefully still have time for some questions. So the first question, obviously, is what should you test? When you start thinking about doing this kind of research, your goals are probably pretty broad. Like, I want to make the library easier to use, or does our website have any problems? But you need to translate that broad goal into some more specific tasks for the test. So how do you come up with those tasks? So in the chat, maybe you could just talk about some things that you have tested before, or some ideas of what you'd like to test at your library. Is my signage working? Oh, good. That's how it's. I'm very interested in doing research outside of websites. I've only done a couple of things like that before. So, how to find databases. Facets, yeah. the functionality of a database, finding information. So here are some broad categories of things that I thought of. The best place to start if you have sort of broad goals is with the most basic, most critical things that you want to be sure your patrons are able to do. So for a library website, this might be finding a book in your catalog, finding out when the library was open, or finding out how to reserve a meeting room, all things that were very popular at previous libraries I've worked at. You might also start with things that you know or suspect your patrons are having trouble with, but you need to convince someone else that these problems exist, or that you're not really sure why your patrons are having problems with them. And finally, it's probably not a good use of your time to test things that you can't fix. So you want your tests to show you ways to make your library better, but realistically you have control only over a certain number of systems. So if you have a database, for example, that you can't really change its interface much, there might not be much of a point in testing its usability because the test won't result in any actionable information for you. The exception to this would be if you have a really critical system, like a very popular database or your ILS, and even if you can't change the interface much, you could do some usability testing to help you show ways that you could better support your patrons and how they use it through help documentation or staff training or something like that. So once you've identified what you're going to test, you have to decide on some specific tasks that you're going to ask the evaluation participants to complete. And they should be clearly related to your goals in doing the study, and they should be similar to things that most of your patrons are already doing in the real world. For each task, you want to develop a plausible scenario that describes to the test participant not only what the task is, but why they are doing it. And scenarios, they help to give more context to the task and help to get the participant more involved in the evaluation. So for instance, in the demo we did with Christine, I had her pretend that she was new to Denver, and so there was a scenario surrounding or giving context to the specific task. And then when you write a task or a scenario, it's really important that the language that you use doesn't too closely match the the jargon that of the system that you're testing. So if you use terms that are taken directly from the menus of your website, say, then the scenario becomes too much of a guide to the participant. The participants want to please you naturally, and so they want to figure out what you want them to do and then do that. And if you use too specific language, then the test becomes just a word hunt, and they just look around on the site for the words that you said, and then they'll click on those. Writing these scenarios can be kind of tricky, and so you might have to go through several revisions to get them right. And so we'll work through an example here. So let's say that you're interested in the usability of your e-resources list on your website, and so that's your study question. How easy is it for patrons to use the e-resources list? So your task might be find a database on a particular subject, but we need to translate that into some sort of scenario. So this is my first draft here. What do you think of this one? So the scenario is you would like to find a database on a particular subject, access the e-resources list, and choose a database for newspapers. How would you grade this as a scenario? That's library language. Too jargony.
And Bobby, Janine gives it a C.
Oh, that's a grade. Okay. It is. Yeah. So I think it's sort of a combination. The first sentence is probably too broad. No one goes to a library website thinking, oh, I need to find a database on a particular subject. And then the second sentence is too specific. You're asking them to access the e-resources list. How many people are really going to know what that is? That might be a word right from your menus. So it's both too broad and then too specific. So let's revise. What do you think about this one? So you are looking for recent news stories about Colorado. Starting from the library homepage, find a database for recent newspaper articles. Yeah. So most people are saying that this is a big improvement, and I think that's right. So you're starting with a more realistic task. Someone might actually come to your website looking for recent news stories about Colorado. Uh, and then you're giving them a specific starting place. So starting from the library homepage, find a database for recent newspaper articles. Um, I'm not real happy with the word database, but it's sort of inescapable for libraries. You have to judge that based on what your own knowledge of your patron's background and skills are. Yeah. So here's a final example. You are looking for recent newspaper articles about Colorado. Starting from the library homepage, find a resource relevant to your search. Resource is too vague, right? So I think the problem with this is not necessarily that the phrasing itself is wrong, but it's wrong for this particular task or this particular goal. You're interested in the e-resources list. You want to direct them toward that in particular. Uh, Asking them to find a resource relevant to your search is too vague. So that might be a good task for testing, say, your navigation menus or some sort of broader goal. But for testing the e-resources list, this is probably too vague. So writing these things, like I said, is kind of an art. And coincidentally, there was an article published recently by the Nielsen Norman Group, which is one of the world's leading user research consultancies. So again, you should look at this after the webinar. They have some good advice on writing usability tasks, and the other articles on that site too are great. It's a super resource. So let's talk a little bit about the technology that you're going to need to complete one of these evaluations. The setting for the study should match as closely as possible the setting where the users you are interested in will actually be using whatever it is that you're testing. So if you're testing your website, for example, you can be almost anywhere as long as you're using a computer and a mouse that the user is likely familiar with. If you're testing something else, like a self-checkout machine or a photocopier or whatever, you're probably not going to want to move those to some new location. But you need to set them up somewhere that would be similar to where they would live when they're actually available to the public. It can be kind of tricky that usually you want the test to happen somewhere relatively private and quiet. Participants in usability tests can sometimes get very anxious about completing the tasks, so you want to set them at ease as much as possible. And they might be reluctant to talk freely in a public setting, so you want them to be as conversational as possible. So finding a quiet room that's set apart is a good idea if that's possible. The exception to this would be if you were just have like maybe one task. Maybe you just set up a table in your lobby and you have a quick usability task that people can do in 5 minutes as they walk through in or out of the library. For that, you can be a lot less formal, and the setting there might not matter so much. I don't know what sort of computer technology that you generally use, but most of the software that you might need and hardware for these tests is readily available. I use a Mac, and recording a screen on a Mac is really simple, and there's all sorts of screen sharing software that's available. For a PC, I'm not familiar with PCs, but you would probably have to get some sort of other software, but I know that there is a lot of free software available for that. If you're testing something that's not online, getting a good recording of it is going to be a little tricky, and so you might not You want to be able to hear what the participant is saying, and you also want to be able to see what the participant is seeing and touching. So you might need a video camera or something like that. Recording the session is optional. I think it's very helpful to do that. But if you can just take good notes, or if you have other observers there who can help you, you might not need a recording at all. In a larger organizations, many of these tests take place where you have a facilitator and the participant, but also some observers. Most of the libraries I've worked at, that wasn't the case, because like I said, I was kind of working on my own. But the other library managers would be able to view the recordings afterwards, but nobody was there watching the sessions. If you have stakeholders, especially if they're kind of skeptical about usability testing, it can be very, very useful to have them present during an evaluation, or somehow observing it, perhaps online from a different room. But if you can't get them to observe, then sharing the recordings, I think, is good enough. This is really important. So after you have the study all set up, you need to pilot it. So get someone unfamiliar with the study, like a coworker or a family member or almost anyone, and run through the entire session with them. So this will help you make sure that your tasks and scenarios make sense and give you a better sense of how the session is going to flow from task to task. It also gives you an opportunity to test out all the technology to make sure that it's going to work correctly when the actual session begins. And if you're recording the sessions, you should also record the pilot test to make sure that the video and the audio are of good enough quality. And then after the pilot test, you probably want to tweak the scenarios a bit, but it's time to start recruiting some participants. Usually, in my experience anyway, this is the phase of the research project that takes the longest and takes most of the effort, though it depends a lot on who you're trying to recruit and how long each session is going to be. So you want to try to get participants who represent the patrons who will be using the system that you're testing. They will give you better information about the system's usability problems. But you're only going to do a handful of tests, so you're not trying for statistical reliability or anything like that. So if you're having trouble getting representative people, but you can get someone else who is thoughtful and articulate and can give you good information and good feedback, then that's great. Go ahead and run the evaluation with them. The only exception to this is that you don't want to include people like other librarians or employees of the library who are already very familiar with the system that you're testing, because they will know the system too well and you won't get valid results. So I'm especially interested in people who have done these sort of usability tests before. So who would you recruit? And how would you go about doing it?
And you can just type your answers. I've got two different boxes there about who you would recruit, and then maybe some ideas about how you would recruit. So you can type in either box. It works very similar to the chat area, and we'll see what you guys have to say.
Frequent patrons, library volunteers.
I like Lois's idea of kind of like targeted groups of people, kind of depending once again on sort of what feedback you want to get back. Do you want older adults to look at it, or kids, or as Valerie said, maybe several different age groups?
Right. Okay. So mostly I've worked in academic libraries before, and so the recruiting, we tried to get a mix of different, like juniors and seniors and freshmen, and then we also did a round with faculty as well, just because we were interested in broad questions about the usability of the website as a whole. For public libraries, you can get way more specific if you want to. And even some academic libraries can get way more specific. There was one organization here in Denver that was doing some usability evaluations with their website, and they had like 9 different user groups that they were going to target. And if you think you need at least 5 people from each of those groups, that's 45 tests, and that's a lot of effort. So I would just say err on the side of inclusiveness. Try to be as broad as possible. If you have some really specific ideas about problems among a particular user group, you can target them fine. But if you have sort of broad ideas or broad goals, don't be too picky about who you're recruiting or what sort of marketing group they might fall into. Try to make it easy on yourself, and do a couple with just sort of easy to recruit people, maybe frequent patrons, and then you might get a better idea from those early sessions about what kind of problems exist, and then you could look at them more in depth with another set of more specifically targeted users. As for how to recruit people, I've had most luck with just flyers in the library, sort of handbill size, things that they can put in their pockets and take with them. And they don't have to be anything fancy, but they should have good information in there about what the purpose of the study is and how long the session will last. And if you have a short enough study to complete, you can also just set up a table in a high traffic area and ask people just passing by to sit down for a 5 or 10 minute test. Some people mentioned in the chat that you could bribe them with candy, and you should definitely offer some sort of reasonable incentive to participants. I don't like sessions to last for more than 30 or 45 minutes, and so the incentive that works is usually pretty small, like a big candy bar or a coupon for a cup of coffee and a pastry or something like that. I think at most I've offered like a $25 gift card for a 45-minute test, and that's about it. If you work at an academic institution, you may have to get your study protocol approved by an institutional review board. Public libraries don't usually have that problem, but at an academic institution, the IRB is usually very easy to work with, and they'll sign off on this kind of study pretty quickly. And again, if you can't really get enough people to come into your library for a session, you can do remote testing. So if you're testing a website, remote sessions are pretty easy, and they usually work okay. You lose something by not being in the same room as the participant, but you can still get a lot of good information, particularly if the participant is very talkative. And if you're really having trouble recruiting anybody, there are commercial agencies that will recruit people for you, or have people that you can hire online, and they'll do their own sort of, you give them the tasks and they'll do the study sort of, or a usability evaluation on their own, and then give you the results. I've never actually done that. I know it's not that expensive, but it would be there if you were desperate for users. So now the fun part begins. Once you have your people recruited and your protocol set up, you get to actually run the evaluations. So usually you'll be sitting next to the person who's the participant who's doing the evaluation, and you have to practice to be a good facilitator, I think. So the first sessions that you do might be a little awkward, but usually we will have written out a standard description of the tasks of the sessions, explaining to the participant what will happen. And you want to be sure that that the participant knows that it's a test of the system, not them. So it's not like a skills test or something like that. And ask them to use the system as they normally would, except to think out loud, and emphasize that there are no right or wrong answers, and you just want to see how the participant interacts with the system. While the participant is working on the task, you want to be able to signal to them that you're paying attention to what they're saying, but you don't want to give them any help in completing the task. So this can be very challenging for librarians, especially because your natural inclination is to say, oh, it's right here, here you go. But you can't do that during the session. You have to let the participants themselves work things out and keep them talking about their experience. So you're kind of like a therapist during the tests. So you don't have any of the answers, just more questions. The only exception to this would be if the participant asks you to clarify something about the task that you've given them or how you want them to complete the task, and in which case you would, of course, answer. So keeping the session on track can sometimes be a challenge. Sometimes a participant will get hopelessly lost while they are trying to complete a task, but they still want to keep working on it. But you need to be able to step in politely when you feel that you've learned all that you can from a particular task, and then move them along to the next one. I always like to leave time for follow-up questions at the end of the session or even at the end of each task, and for any general comments the participant might have about the system or the test. So you often learn a lot from these comments. And then this is basic, I probably don't need to say this, but I think it's really important to end the session on time, to be respectful of other people's time, unless the participant is still giving you useful information and they have explicitly agreed to stay longer. Otherwise, it's just impolite. So let's, after you've done a session, you've probably tried to take some notes during it. I find it very difficult to take notes and talk to someone at the same time. But after a session is done, I will jot down things before I forget them. I think that's if you have notes that you were able to take, you should review them and make sure that they're clear to you and they've correctly captured everything that you noticed during the session. And then if you've recorded the sessions, I like to record the sessions, and then after all the evaluations are done, I watch the recordings and I review them, ideally one after the other. So it gives you a better sense about of the patterns that people's activities fall into, and things that more than one participant did or said during the evaluation. As far as how you record the results, you can do that in any way that's convenient to you. I personally like Excel spreadsheets, but you can just use notes or diagrams or whatever works best for you. There are many different kinds of metrics that you can use. Mostly we've talked here about just identifying patterns, really qualitative stuff, but you can try to capture some quantitative information. But your choice depends a lot on what you're testing and how many evaluations that you're going to do. But maybe you guys could think of what kind of other metrics could you do for these kinds of evaluations? Time, right. Number of clicks. So yeah, time on task, how long it takes someone to complete a particular task, the number of clicks that they make while completing a task. So in that case, you would have a sense of what the normal or what the optimal click path is to completing a goal or fulfilling the task. And you'd be able to say whether someone was far above or far below it. Keep track of their mumblings. Yeah, I don't know of any sort of quantitative level of frustration unless you're doing eye tracking or sort of measuring skin conductivity or something like that. I've never done anything so sophisticated. But you could do that. But generally it's sort of it's qualitative. your own sense of how frustrated they are and something like that. There is actually there's a formula, you could probably Google it, for lostness. So how lost a patron gets while completing the task. And basically it's based on clicks or page views or something like that. Swear words. I like that one. So the basic metric that I use for these tasks is just whether the patron or the participant succeeded or failed at the task. Sometimes this is also kind of qualitative. It's your judgment as to whether they succeeded or failed based on the restrictions that the task gave them. Sometimes the participant will think that they succeeded at a task, but in fact, according to the criteria of the test, they really didn't. Or the participant will think that they failed when you think they actually succeeded. So again, it's kind of qualitative, but you have at least just sort of a binary, a yes, no. Did they succeed or fail? But regardless, it's almost always going to be really more your judgment, unless you're doing 20 or so tests or something like that, and have some more statistically robust measures that you can look at. But having some sort of criteria set ahead of time can help you sort of do a check on your judgment and make sure that you're not just your subjective judgment is sort of disciplined by that, and that's very useful. So once you think you've identified some of the problems, how do you go about fixing them? So one of the problems with the usability test is that it doesn't explicitly tell you how to fix the problems. It just helps you identify the problems, what the problems are, not how to fix them. So you're going to have to come up with solutions yourself. Obviously, you want to fix the most critical problems first, so you prioritize them, and then work down the list as time and money permit. And you want to, this is a quote from Steve Krug, tweak, don't redesign. So you might find a bunch of usability problems, and you might be tempted to try and fix them all in one fell swoop, or just redesign the entire site or something like that. But that's going to take a long time, and in the meantime, these problems are still out there making your patrons frustrated and miserable. So you want to do the simplest and fastest things that you can to fix the problems quickly. So just tweak and don't redesign, although you can still redesign later if you think that's necessary. With many systems, you might identify problems that you can't fix, and so you're just going to have to patch them. So maybe you don't have control over the interface and you can't customize it, or the problem is how a particular machine or your building is built or something like that. In these cases, you need to think of ways you can patch the problem rather than fix it. So you might make some better signs, say, or some clearer instructions or something to help patrons get around the problem, or it may be some more staff training or something like that that would help remedy that problem. And then after your fixes are in place, like I said, this study methodology doesn't really tell you exactly how to fix the problems. It just helps you find the problems. So you're going to try to fix them, but then you need to test your fixes with another study to see if you've actually fixed the problems that you wanted to fix. So this might seem a little frustrating, like you won't ever be done with anything. And you probably won't, because every system will always have some sort of usability problem. But hopefully, with these sort of iterative fixes, it's a virtuous cycle. And with every time that you go around, you're making your library better and improving the lives of your patrons, which of course is the goal.
And Bobby, we had a quick question about when you retest, do you do the same exact test with kind of the same?
I would. I mean, you don't have to repeat the same tasks word for word necessarily, but you want to be sure that the participants in the second round kind of represent the same groups that were in the first round, and that they're doing basically the same thing. It's not important, like I said, that you do it word for word, but you want to be sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So this is some more sort of quick information about usability testing that I think is really, really helpful. The first is Steve Krug's books. So the first one is Rocket Surgery Made Easy. I mean, that one's more focused on usability testing. And the other one, Don't Make Me Think, is more about usable website design more broadly. So if you think you're good with usability design and you're just interested in user research, just get Rocket Surgery Made Easy. And Don't Make Me Think is a broader book, though it's still really good. But they're short, and he writes well, so they're very easy to read, and he's got a lot of good information in there. There are lots of good websites about usability and user research, and these are three of my favorites. Usability.gov is run by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it's got great information about usability and user research methods. And I plugged an article from the Nielsen Norman Group before, but their whole website is really worth checking out, and you can sign up for their email list. So when a new article comes out, they'll let you know via email, and that's also very useful. They publish pretty lengthy reports that you can buy, but they usually have summaries of their reports that are available for free. And the information on their site is a little more advanced maybe than you'll get from Steve Krug or usability.gov, but they still can be very, very helpful. And then the last one is the Usability Body of Knowledge. This was put together by a UX professional group, and ironically I don't think it's been updated recently, so its design looks kind of dated, but it is still usable, and it still has a lot of good information about various kinds of user research and analysis. And then there's this guy who works at the State Library, and so I would love to help you get started doing usability testing if you're interested in doing it. So feel free to email me if you'd like some advice in how to set up your evaluations, if you have any questions related to user experience, or even I have done just some consulting where I had clients ask me to do usability testing. So if you don't want to do the testing yourself but would like some testing done, I might be able to help you out. Just let me know. And that's the end of my formal presentation. So hopefully you guys have comments or questions, or you are interested in doing some usability tests, and maybe you could tell me what kind of usability test that you'd like to try.
And while you all are maybe sharing usability tests you'd like to try or thinking of questions that you would like to share, I did just want to mention, if any of you need a certificate from today's session, I am putting my email in the chat area so that you can send me a quick email and I can send you a certificate, hopefully this afternoon, if not, hopefully by tomorrow.
So Lisa says that they've been thinking of just grabbing folks as they come in and giving them an iPad and giving them a few tasks. I think that's a great idea. You might have some added complications because maybe they're not terribly familiar with the iPad or the interface is a little different. But that kind of quick guerrilla usability testing can be really useful. And you usually get a fair number of participants that way pretty quickly. Diane asks, how frequently do participants forget you're testing the system and not evaluating them? It depends. Sometimes it's really surprising how emotionally involved some people will get in a usability task. But again, as a facilitator, you kind of have to give them some room to step back or try to keep them on task and sort of maybe move them along to something else. I've never had anybody get like really depressed or really upset, but it can happen, yeah. Have you ever done usability testing for anything that wasn't online or a digital interface, say book lists, shelf talkers, research guide? I haven't. All the systems I've tested have been online, but there have been other librarians who have done tests of, say, how their books are laid out in their main room. So, for instance, they used a card sorting research method to get people to divide new titles into categories that made the most sense to them, and then they use that information to arrange their shelving. There's also been studies of just signage. So someone comes up to the checkout desk or the reference desk, and you show them two versions of a sign and ask them which is better, and then boom, that's it. That's a test. You can get a lot of information that way. So if you're thinking about doing a usability evaluation in a non-digital environment, let me know. I'd be interested in doing that. I don't really see, the only real technical problem I foresee is getting a good recording of it if you want to record it.